Hello, I'm Gina Cacceci, webinar host with WCG CenterWatch. Welcome to today's webinar on 5 Steps to TMF Inspection Readiness. This webinar is brought to you by Agatha. We're expecting the session to last about 45 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please feel free to prepare questions for our presenters. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the formal presentation. The questions will be addressed at the end. To ask a question, simply type it in the area provided and press enter. Questions will not be viewable to other attendees. It's my pleasure now to introduce our host for today. Ken Lownie is the head of North American operations for Agatha, a strategic software solutions provider to the healthcare and life sciences industry. He has years of experience working with life sciences companies and understands the unique challenges these groups face. Mr. Lownie has worked with companies considering an eTMF application and recognizes the various drivers and concerns that come with the change, along with the features and functions of a modern eTMF system. Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's so formal. The one on the screen might represent me a little better. I live in New Hampshire on a small farm property with 6 goats, 3 pigs, and now 18 chickens because the slide is out of date. But I guess both are true. I do head up Agatha's worldwide business, and I do focus a lot on clinical operations software. That's been my reason for living career-wise for a long time. So today, what a fun event we have planned. This is about inspection readiness. My co-host, who I'll introduce in a moment, Janine, and I have talked about this a lot, and we've talked about how much things have changed. And that led me to write the boxed summary that the days of scrambling to get ready for an audit need to be gone. The idea that an audit's coming, you'll be notified, and there's 3 weeks of hell getting ready for it, need to be made a thing of the past, and that the clarion call is for inspection readiness at all time during a study. I have some knowledge of this, but I'm lucky to have an expert with me. So please welcome Janine Penman. Janine and I have spoken together on lots of occasions on different topics. She's a delight, very, very articulate. Sometimes I play word vocabulary bingo when she's talking to see if I get a new word out of her. So Janine, can you do a quick introduction of yourself? For me, Janine is on mute. Is that okay, Craig?
I am not on mute any longer. So it's nice to be with you again, Ken, and thanks for the introduction. Just briefly, quickly about me. I'm the founder of a company called JPScientific. JPScientific, we support clinical development and quality management and eClinical systems as an advisory consulting firm, as well as providing services. My background is all in pharmaceutical. It has been 20 plus years in clinical development and operations. And then about the past 10 years, I've really taken a turn to focus on quality management systems and eClinical systems, the TMF of which is one very critical eClinical system, and focused on how we can utilize those eClinical systems to reduce the cost in clinical trials, increase efficiency, and increase, of course, data quality. So it's nice to speak with you today again, Ken.
Even nicer for me. I have one off-topic question that I don't think I've ever asked you, Janine. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in the United States, in the state of Pennsylvania, in a town most people have not heard of, but it is literally the only town in Pennsylvania. It's a town called Bloomsburg.
I do know where it is. I'm just always trying to place your voice in my mind. You've got a New York cadence, meaning you deliver a lot of information very quickly, but you enunciate very clearly like a Midwesterner. And that must be the Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania, parts of Pennsylvania have sort of a Midwest feel to them, you know, friendly and funny.
Oh, especially where I'm from.
So, yeah, exactly. Where you call soda pop instead of soda. I talked about the old days of audits and the new days, so I thought I'd capture that in this little snippet here, where one side saying we need to prepare for our audit. The inspectors are coming, and the answer is, well, organize a game of dodgeball, because that's what we're going to be playing. So the idea of a responsive model, and again, Janine and I have talked about this a lot. We've used all different metaphors. I used a preteen or a tween's bedroom as the example of, is it inspection ready, or is it totally reactive after begging to be cleaned? And for many of us in life sciences, there's been an element of that tween's bedroom of not it being inspection ready, begging it to get ready, and then a big scurry to do it all at once. I also have the experience of my wife was in a business where she was subject to audits periodically, and she was responsible for them. And there is no one in the earth more organized than Mary Lownie. And yet even she, for 3 days, had to get out the banker's boxes, tab everything, put everything in the right folder, make sure everything was ready for the inspector. So we all probably are familiar with that model. And now we have this term, inspection readiness. To me, traditionally, inspection readiness means spend a few days, a few weeks, or a month, a lot of man hours getting ready, and that's inspection readiness. But that's not what we mean at all anymore. So I wanted to engage Janine in the conversation with these kinds of topics. These aren't specific questions, but more think of it as a blue book essay question. This is the essay question. You can talk about whatever you want. Why did it change? Why do we need a different approach? And is it true that it's actually required by the regulators, by the FDA specifically? That's what I want to catch up with. It's clearly the right thing to do, but most of us don't do the right things. So what's changed, Janine?
So what I think recently, not so recently, but fairly recently, and not necessarily because of COVID either, which I want to make sure I point out. I think I've lost you on camera, but I still have you on audio?
We do. So go ahead. Don't worry about the camera.
Okay. Perfect. All right. Sounds good. So what's changed in the past few years is that inspection readiness is actually becoming required for the ICH guidelines. It used to be that
inspection would be announced.
We have 2 microphones open. I think you fixed it. Someone fixed it. Go ahead, try. That is not me. This is Ken.
Unmuted.
Let's do another try, Janine.
I'm muted completely everywhere else.
Okay.
Now.
Let's go ahead.
Are we good? All right. Much better.
Thank you.
Okay. If that camera
you were talking about the
you
were talking about
I'm gonna let it go.
everything's good. And
okay.
You were talking about the ICH guidelines.
Okay, so back at it. The ICH guidelines are actually changing to require inspection readiness. There used to be a time when audits would be announced, and it was pretty standard that they would be announced. They weren't always announced. Quite frankly, there have always been unplanned and impromptu audits, especially if there's a cause involved. But planned audits are becoming more impromptu than planned. And for that reason, the ICH guidelines are changing to recognize the fact that running a good quality clinical trial according to good clinical practice doesn't necessarily come through in the spirit of scrambling at the last minute to put your documentation together. That's not necessarily the spirit of maintaining a state of good clinical practice throughout your trial and being able to document the history of the trial. So inspection readiness is the idea that you're always ready for an audit, and the ICH has really started to word their guidelines in such a way that says blatantly, you should always be ready for an audit. You shouldn't scramble at the last minute. So inspection readiness is really a regulatory requirement now, and it's not because of COVID.
So that's really interesting that it's worked its way from the right thing to do and a good idea to be even being called out in ICH guidelines. Here's what I've never looked into. The word is very broad, inspection readiness, and that you should maintain that. Can you just, with your own words, give some examples of what that means? Here's the interesting part. It's very clear to me what it doesn't mean. I can tell what not being inspection ready looks like. and it's kind of like this, caught in bed naked with the FDA looking through your window. So that's very clearly not ready for an inspection. What does inspection readiness look like to you?
Inspection readiness in its true spirit looks like the FDA shows up at my window in the middle of the night, and all I have to do is log into a system, give them read-only access, and go back to bed. That's what true inspection readiness is.
So documents are up to date, where they belong, deduped, and organized. I'm quite knowledgeable about the documentation side, the TMF side. Are there other aspects that I'm missing that aren't just on the documentation side?
Well, sure. There's a whole story that is the TMF that isn't just your eTMF, which is the system that Agatha supports. The story of the clinical trial extends beyond the electronic trial master file. It is housed at the site. It's housed in your clinical data. It's housed in your regulatory documents. They might be in a separate system. It could be partly housed in your clinical trial management system, which may or may not be connected to your TMF. And so there are definitely other places where this information lives. And lately, when we've really started to embrace real-world data and passive data collection from things like devices like watches or monitors that people and patients can wear, data lives there too. And information and history about the trial and about the patients, anonymously of course, lives in those spaces. So anywhere that the story of the clinical trial lives is your TMF. And that is part of an inspection readiness plan.
I love that wording, the story of the clinical trial. Sometimes when I am doing real basic education on what is the trial master file, I try to bring it back to that. The trial master file is the essential documents. What are the essential documents? The essential documents are the documents needed to tell the story of the clinical trial, to document the steps taken, the plans made, etc. But I've never used that phrase, so kudos to you and thank you for the story of the clinical trial. That's really what the FDA is interested in. So we've talked about this enough now to say, how do we define it? By the way, I loved your response to the cartoon, which I have to tell everyone you had never seen before. And your immediate response was, well, the cartoon's just different. You're dressed and ready to go. So that's a pretty simple way to do it. And then we talked about some of the specific requirements. Documents are ready for inspection, etc. I don't know whether you've been involved in an FDA inspection that truly was conducted with a sponsor or CRO that was completely inspection ready. But whether you have or not, how do you think it would be different? Do you think the experience of the audit would be different?
Oh, it's like night and day. I mean, it's completely different. An inspection ready audit, and I have been involved in audits that were I would call inspection ready. Inspection readiness, by the way, is a continuum. It's not a state of being where you just tick a box and say, yep, we're inspection ready, good to go. It is literally a continuum, and I would say on the far extreme of the continuum, you have not ready at all. You have no idea where your stuff is. Your TMF isn't put together. Your eTMF is scrambled documents in random folders in a non-compliant system. That's not inspection ready. Inspection readiness at the other extreme is everything is in order, 100% beyond human error. And I don't think any of those two extremes really exist in 99.9% of the instances, at least that I've seen, and I suspect in the industry at large. Usually most clients are somewhere on a continuum. And I would say most clients live somewhere at the 50% mark plus or minus 20%. It's a big range. But there's a huge difference when you enter an audit situation, inspection ready versus more inspection ready versus less inspection ready. More inspection ready tends to happen when sponsors have more notice. And so I do think, to the point of this webinar, I think there are very few sponsors, very, very few in fact, who live in a state of more than 80% inspection ready at all times right now. With the announcement of an audit, they get there, and some get there more quickly than others. But the idea of inspection readiness isn't to find out about an audit and then get there. The idea is to just live there. It's the place we live. And so I think very few sponsors are doing that, and that's why, and that's why indeed we talk about it. That's why my company exists. This is why we are talking about this today. so that we can let sponsors know that you can get there easily. It doesn't have to be difficult, and you can live in a state of inspection readiness. And if it's only 75 or 80% or maybe even 60% to start, you're better off than you were before not planning for inspection readiness. So there's a reduction in stress significantly. There's also a reduction in resources and manpower, and seriously a reduction in cost, because a lot of companies, what they will do is when they find out about an audit, they will go to a quality company or a TMF services company, and they will scramble and hire services, and those services can be extraordinarily pricey. And so it costs money, and then it costs resources at the sponsor to manage those services. Or if you're doing it internally, handling it yourself, you have to make sure you have the right brain power and the brain trust at the table to make sure you are inspection ready. If you don't, you're scrambling to look for consultants. So living in that state reduces stress, reduces cost, reduces the strain on your resources.
And risk, of course, because, when you scramble to get ready, it's different than maintaining readiness in terms of missing something. The other thing I wanted to mention on how is an inspection different, so we've had a few customers go through inspections with our software. And what I find interesting is that by providing the inspector access to the Agatha software system with their own access rights to go ahead and inspect documents and stuff, it's a very different experience, and it's a huge confidence and credibility building experience for the inspector, because they're seeing your system live through their lens, of course, an inspector's lens, with the right access controls. But we get great feedback on that. So all of that is interesting. Now, you said you think a small percentage of sponsors maintain that readiness, and I only want to echo that. I think it's even more so with Agatha's client base, because we tend to focus on the smaller organizations, the smaller sponsors and CROs. And to pull that out, we're going to actually do a quick poll and see how it compares. So I'm going to ask our producers to put up a poll, and it's about how would you rate yourself on inspection readiness. And I'll read through the responses, but you'll have the chance to reply in just a moment. The first is you're completely ready at all times. You are aces on inspection readiness. The second is we're close to inspection ready. We're generally close. It would take just a couple of days. The third, we're not very inspection ready. We'd have to do a lot of preparation. 4, it would be a crisis. We'd need weeks. We'd need to hire an outside company. We need to prepare. By the way, I should point out this is anonymous, so you can be honest. And then lastly, not applicable or other, that you're a different kind of organization. So to our producers, Gina, I'm not seeing the poll. I think
well, the polls are live. The polls are live. Choose one answer and click submit.
Great.
And we'll leave the polls open for a few more seconds.
There it is. Sorry. You had told me exactly how to do that, Gina, and I didn't.
That's okay. So we'll keep the polls open for another 15 seconds. So choose one of these 5 answers and click submit. And in about 10 seconds, we will show the results. We want to give everybody a chance to submit. Polls will close in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here are the results.
Cool. So, very impressive, Janine. So no one is so audacious to say that you're completely inspection ready at almost all times. That was none. But 61% say generally close to inspection ready, would take just a couple of days. So I'm very impressed by that. Not very is 30%. And the last one, it would be a crisis. No one was willing to say that. And if I felt that was true about me, I wouldn't say it either. And then not applicable is 9%. So Gina, I misspoke. I'm sorry, Janine. It's kind of in the middle, 61 and 30% for options 2 and 3. So maybe a little more ready than we thought they would be.
It sounds like it. I'm actually a little surprised. We typically get at least a few people saying, "Yeah, I'm a mess. I have no idea. We're a disaster if we have to be audited." I think there's been a lot more attention on inspection readiness as of late, and that might be what we're seeing. We're seeing a little bit more attention to it, which is good news.
Yeah, it's great news. It'll be interesting to see in our next poll, which isn't just yet, but in our next poll when we ask about technology. So we'll see how those compare. Before we do that, I wanted to bring a focus to technology. So this little subsection is the role of technology in regard to readiness. Now, as has been communicated during our conversation, I am a software person. I'm a technologist. I've been delivering software solutions to clinical operations teams for a really long time, can I say? You can see the white hair. So for decades, not years. So I'm really deeply in that space, and therefore I have a bias that says if you want inspection readiness, I don't see how you do that without a fit-for-purpose application in the eTMF, in the TMF space to manage those capabilities. We know that lots of sponsors and CROs don't do that. They collect their documents, keep them in a file share in organized folders, hopefully, and they manually dedupe and keep track of versions. So I wanted to overcome my prejudice by asking you, Janine, do you think an actual eTMF is critical? Why can't you just store them in an organized repository somewhere, folderized appropriately?
An eTMF, a validated eTMF is business critical. People do, I don't endorse it, but it's a possibility. You can keep your documents for a little while in random folders and Box or even in an Ignite, which is not a TMF. A TMF is, like you said, built for purpose, and it does a few things that these other systems don't really do. The first thing is it provides you an audit trail for all of the documents. So it has document control, and that is a requirement for a system that's going to house essential documents that you use to prove the history of your trial. So most of those other systems don't have that level of document control that the agencies need to see. The second thing is that it's not necessarily organized according to the DIA reference model. Right now we're on 3.2. Some of them may be organized similarly to that, but you're going to spend a lot of time setting up your own folders and recreating that DIA model when the DIA reference model is present in most TMFs, including Agatha's. I know it comes out of the box ready like that. So to me, choosing another system that is not a TMF and a validated TMF is setting up yourselves for issues if you do end up in an audit, especially an unplanned one, because you won't have time to migrate. And you're also just making yourselves a lot of extra work. You're taking a lot of extra time. And spoiler alert, TMFs are not priced so high that they're incomparable with things like Box or Ignite. You actually might find as a sponsor that you save money by getting a fit size validated TMF rather than thinking you're saving all this money just by going with folders for now. And I bring that up here because you mentioned a lot of your clients are smaller companies, and I see smaller companies doing that quite a bit because they believe it's going to save them money, and I don't think that's necessarily an accurate perception.
You know, sometimes I think you and I just are using one brain because I had a couple of things that I thought I would be saying, but you really hit them well. That said, I'll still repeat them, which is, on the one hand, I'm always surprised at how many of Agatha's customers, and it could be more than 40%, come to us and say, so I'm storing my content in Box, in Dropbox, or on a shared folder. I know I shouldn't be, and can you help? So we do get a lot of people starting there. And there's two ways I always respond. The first is not very nice of me to say, you know, that's not really compliant, don't you? Because it's virtually impossible that they're meeting all the documentation requirements of other parts of FDA regulation for signatures, version management, audit trails, et cetera, that you really need to be 21 CFR Part compliant. So I start there, but that's not a very nice way to start. I like the way you started because it's definitely true. To do the work in a shared folder system, to set up all those folders, maintain it, etc., I'm virtually certain costs more in the end than using a service a solution, a piece of software, a SaaS solution that does it for you in an eTMF. And I think you're right. People, in our industry, there's an interesting thing. A lot of people start in big pharma and end up in smaller pharma. And I think what happens is when they do that, they say, oh, at big pharma, we used Vivo, we used open text, Documentum, etc. So the perception they have is built back in those big companies. And they think, well, we don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to do the way we did it at big pharma X. And that's what you said, spoiler alert, that there are systems like Agatha's, but there's others that are not measured in those dollars at all. These are subscription-based, ready-to-use models that are much, much easier. So I think that's a really important point, that it's not do what you're doing or spend a lot of money. It's spend money on money and effort on A, or spend money and effort on B. And with B, you get a better result towards inspection readiness, lower risk, etc. Now that said, I'm sorry, Janine, you go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to say there are two more points to that too that I want to make sure that people hear. The first thing is there's another aspect of a validated TMF that doesn't exist in systems like Ignite or Box, and that's reporting. And reporting is essential to maintaining inspection readiness. You can't maintain inspection readiness without reporting. So if you don't have a validated TMF like Agatha's or like others, like you said, there are other systems out there, each with its own set of attributes. But if you don't have a validated system, you don't have reporting. And if you don't have reporting, you don't have inspection readiness. So that's really the message I think we want to drive home here today is that exactly. Very important.
You might be the most quotable person I know. If you don't have a TMF, you don't have reporting. If you don't have reporting, you don't have inspection readiness. I get that because, of course, our system and most systems like ours feature the what's missing capability. What should I have in my TMF based on the reference model? What don't I have yet? So really hard to be ready for inspection without doing that. To our listeners and viewers, I want you to know that we see some video bouncing in and out. We're not too worried about it. A couple of technical issues. We're concerned mostly that you can hear our voices. So we're not worried about it. Don't worry too much about it. I am going to go ahead and launch another poll. So we'll ask for help from our producers. We'll see that poll come up, and I'll read through it to give you some time to get oriented. So I'm asking you, the people who are listening, how do you manage TMF content in your organization, assuming you're a sponsor or a CRO and you have responsibilities for this? Here's 5 choices. We collect them through various means, through emails, dare I say faxes, and other means, and the content is stored here and there and everywhere. So I did this in the reverse order. That's obviously the least desirable state, but I did like my poetic choice of here and there and everywhere. A little Seussian piece. Number 2, we use a shared network drive and folders to collect the content. So we pull it all together. We have a network drive somewhere on premise or in the cloud, but we do it. Or we use a product like Box or Dropbox or SharePoint, and we use that to store and organize the TMF content. That's choice number 3. Or number 4, in fact, we do use an eTMF product that allows us to collect, manage, and monitor the TMF. Or number 5, it's not applicable to us. We're a different kind of company, so thanks for asking, but not me. So Gina, I know the poll is up, and based on your experience, I'll take your advice about how long to leave it up.
Okay, and just a reminder, the poll appears under the Q&A panel for our attendees. And if you're viewing the presentation in full screen, escape out of full screen to see the poll question. So we'll leave the poll up for another 12 seconds.
I will note that while we wait, someone is brave enough to say choice number 1, that we stored here and there and everywhere.
But remember, your answers are anonymous. We only see the results.
100%.
All right, the poll will close in 3 seconds.
All right.
Here are the results.
So as I said, we had one answer. That was choice number 1, the least desirable state. 32%, a lot, not quite a plurality, but a lot, saying that it's in a network drive and folders. If you add that to the next one, that's 40%. So network drives, Box, Dropbox, SharePoint, you're at 40%. And those are the folks who I think need to think about the transition for many reasons towards an eTMF. And then interestingly, again, an advanced group, Janine, 48%, almost half in the plurality, say they do use an eTMF already. So we have an advanced group in terms of inspection readiness, and we have an advanced group in terms of eTMF use, at least among smaller companies, 8% not applicable. So we're dealing with some real smart people here, Janine.
Yeah, it's a good thing. And we're going to, at some point, probably circle back and match up these poll responses, because I think they correlate a little bit.
Yeah, I do too. I'm pretty sure we would find that. All right. Well, thank you for that piece. Now, we have two little sections that I'm thinking as the game show part, sort of a game show. And I might need help from our producers for just a minute. We're going to make a list of the most important eTMF requirements. If you're shopping for an eTMF, what will it be? I'm going to start, Janine will take a turn, but I also want the listeners to put it in. There's a public chat box. You know, I hope I'm describing this right. There's a public chat box on the right-hand side. Again, if you're in full screen mode, hit escape. And go ahead and add something in there. So I'm just going to put a note here. And you'll see I just put note in that box. So please add your own. What are the most important eTMF requirements? And I thought I had a picture for one of these. I may have not been being as creative by then. Oh, I know what I wanted to do. I wanted to actually answer. I said I would go first, but tell you why. And it will take me 2 slides to do so. So my answer to the very first thing of what's most important is that document management systems go back a long time here, and that includes systems in pharma used for TMF. And they go back all the way to the 90s. And I think of it generationally that there were 3 generations: the age of Documentum, very expensive, very large software implementations, highly customized at big pharma. And then the next generation, the age of SharePoint. So 15 years ago, moving to make it easier for IT. They didn't have to have a specialized application built on top of Documentum or OpenText. And we lived there for quite a while, still on-premise, still quite expensive with customized modules. And then the age of Viva that started 13 years ago, or at least Viva did, with package modules that ran in the cloud. So those are 3 generations of software that I've lived through. What I find fascinating is that the generational shift each time made it easier for IT, but not for users and managers, because this went from custom applications to modular applications to cloud-based applications. But the basic feel of these applications through 3 generations has still been towards big pharma, complicated big systems. So my biggest first answer is it should be a 4th generation product. And for me, a 4th generation eTMF is cloud-based, and it's a ready-to-use application. It's not something you're going to spend weeks or even months doing workshops on your requirements. You're going to say, we all know what a TMF is. There's a reference model. We know it has to have version control, check-in, check-out, audit trails, B21 CFR. We know all these things. So yeah, I'll take one. Thank you very much. So that's my answer, cloud-based and ready to use. Janine, it's your turn to play our game.
Okay, well, I believe that the most important aspect of a TMF is that it is fit for purpose, and that encompasses a few things. So fit for purpose means that it's right-sized to your company, but it also means that your company can use it. So I guess when you say easy to use, I'm also saying the same thing, but I think from a different perspective. When I say easy to use, I mean it from the user's perspective, because that's the perspective that I have. If people don't know how to use the system, they won't use the system. And if the system doesn't get used, you're not inspection ready.
Well, you know, that's really another pithy little way of saying it. I'm going to add to that. So when I say a ready-to-use application, what I mean is you're near ready to use. It should still be configurable, You still have to adjust workflows. You might have parts of the reference model you need or don't need. I get all that. But it should be fundamentally very close to a complete app ready to use. And then, as part of this 4th generation, it has to be a modern, easy-to-use application. This can't be something that you say, and we're going to send you to training for 2 days on how to do this. It just doesn't work that way in this generation. No one does that. It has to be easy to use because it all comes down to will people use it or not. My favorite metaphor here, Janine, I hope I haven't used it before, is the many pieces of exercise equipment that people buy and store. So the exercise bikes that become coat hangers in the corner of their room because they thought they would solve the problem by buying the equipment. And then they forgot, oh, yeah, the discipline part, I have to use that thing. Probably why Peloton is doing good because it's an exercise bike, but it's easier and funner, excuse my language, to use. So I think of software the same way. It has to be easy to use from the user's perspective to ensure rapid adoption. Now, I haven't seen any contributions from the public. Don't make me beg, but I'd love to see messages from any of you, and there's a lot of you out there who could add another thing that you feel. While I wait for that, I'll say the reference model is really important here, I think, Janine. I hesitate because there's 2 things that, of course, is the answer. That any eTMF has to be based on the reference model, and it has to be 21 CFR compliant or the equivalent in EU or Asia. So I'll give those as given. But I will mention the reference model and highlight what I said before. When we say a system is based on the reference model, you want the answer to be yes, but you also don't want it to be a force fit. If you're a device company, there's parts of the reference model that matter to you and parts that don't matter to you. So you should always be able to go ahead and modify the expected documents. Most systems like ours let you say, here's the reference model. Now here, out of the reference model is what we expect in the TMF for this study. That allows us to then say, so what's missing as you do it? All that makes sense to you, Janine?
It makes perfect sense, actually. It makes quite good sense. And I would even go so far as to say you do need to take a look at your reference model when you start your study. If there are things that are not applicable, folders that are not applicable, you need to hide or delete them. Because having a bunch of empty folders hanging out there is just red herrings for auditors. And you don't want them to go in there and feel like there's a bunch of stuff missing, and then they need to actually speak with you and interview you to find out that those folders are not applicable to the type of study that you ran.
That makes great sense. Really hadn't thought about it from that auditor perspective. A bunch of not applicables is not comforting. Much better that everything expected is no longer a placeholder. It's there, or it's waiting to be filled or whatever. So that makes great sense. Thank you to the audience. We've had a couple of additions. Full audit trail, absolutely. And by the way, people often mix 2 things in Audit Trail. You want to see every version of a document, what changed between versions of the document. Of course, that's critical to Audit Trail. But you also want to see all sign-offs, approvals, and reviews if you're putting documents through approval and review cycles, which should be captured automatically. And as they say, but wait, there's more. So you also want to see all login activity and user activity. So when you say Audit Trails, it can be interpreted as 3 things. I want to see every version change in the document. I want to see every review and approval of that document through its life cycle. And I want to see all access to the system. All of that, to go with Stephen's point, should be in there. Now, Constantina added what we were talking about, expected document list customization. Great verbiage there, Constantina. Thank you. So that's what we were trying to say. You can start with the reference model. That's step 1, but step 2 is based off the reference model as a subset of that superset, what is expected in the document list. Absolutely. And then you should have always the ability to see what's missing.
Yep.
You should always be able to say that. Go ahead, Janine.
No, I was going to say, that's a phenomenal requirement or phenomenal thing you should want to see. The expected document index is exactly what we QC against. And in order to maintain a set of inspection-ready TMF, an inspection-ready TMF, and especially if you work with a services team, which a lot of smaller companies do, they don't necessarily always use internal resources, especially to start. Having that expected document index and having it up to date is business critical. So kudos to you for keeping it, because it's a tool that we use to go in and do quality health checks through TMF, whether you do those annually or quarterly, or if you're going to be audited, you need that in preparation for your final inspection readiness. So I can't overstate the importance of that actual document. And it takes a long time to create that sometimes. With companies that have multiple clinical trials running, a lot of times a TMF person, if they're assigned as a dedicated resource, will have to go back to clinical teams and then go back to CROs to find out what's even supposed to be on that list. That is one of the most time-consuming things in a quality health check for a TMF. So word to the wise for everybody who's listening, create your expected document index, create it a priori. You can always modify it, but treat it like it's almost part of your TMF, because literally it's the table of contents for your TMF.
For those of you who are playing along, a priori is the word of the day. So thank you very much, Janine. I knew we'd get one. Love that. Stephen, who I'm going to call SVA, Stephen, because I had a friend with a similar name and they were SVA, mentioned QC review. And he was also talking about more than that. So, of course, a QC function, the ability to do a full QA of each document, mark it qualified, quality inspected or not, is simple. To do that statistically is a nice feature. And especially what Steve mentioned, or SVA mentioned, which is a reconciliation workflow, which is, okay, there is an issue. Now what's going to happen with that? So there's a workflow to perhaps demote its version, forward it to someone for remediation, then go through another review and approval. So I really like that as part of getting it ready for inspection. And John added metrics. And Janine, I know dashboards and metrics have a big part of your heart these days. You've been helping Agatha in terms of our thinking of our dashboard, which is a new we've hugely enhanced it as a new feature. So that makes perfect sense to me. What are some of the metrics you'd want to see on a trial master file system, Janine?
Well, you definitely want to see, and missing documents, I think, is the number one thing that everybody gravitates toward. They want to know what's there and what's not there. But you need to go deeper than that, because you might have a lot of documents in queue, we'll call it, and those documents will show up on a missing documents list, so you don't really get a good flavor for what's missing. I think levels of missing documents, understanding literally where documents are in each phase. So if you have a holding room, it would be good to know how many documents are in that holding room even. I think that's going to be helpful to a lot of users. If you have documents in queue for QC workflow, it's helpful to know that. And of course, it's helpful to know what folders have missing documents and what folders have fully approved documents. So when you go in to do a TMF health check, you don't actually even need to go into the system and run a lot of reports. You can log into the system and you can see it right there in your dashboard. That saves hours. Literally hours and hours of sponsor time, or of your CRO time, or of your services team time. Whatever it is, it's creating efficiency. And the most important part, maybe for some of you or a lot of you on the phone, if you work at small companies, you know that reporting is business critical, because your leadership, your management is constantly requiring status updates on how you're doing, because their stakeholders are requiring status updates for how you're doing. So if you can readily turn over that information to them, that makes for a really transparent environment, but also makes for a really stress-less environment, because your upper management has the data they need. You have the data right at hand that you can pull and give it to them. So I really do think it makes a lot of people's lives easier when you have a dashboard that can tell you where things live at all times, how much is complete, where we are in the QC workflows, and then, of course, you have your history of quality health checks, and that's really important too. Also, I should add, go ahead, please. I was going to say, also, I should add, we haven't gotten there yet, and we may not get there at all today, but I have to give a plug for the Investigator site file being connected somehow to the TMF. So the electronic Investigator site files are so near and dear to my heart and so important, in my opinion, for being inspection readiness. That's a whole other webinar. But for today, I'll just throw it in there by saying, if you have an inspection-ready TMF, it probably means you have some level of Investigator site documents already funneling into your TMF. And knowing the status of each of those and knowing the status of each of your sites is very important for the TMF. Usually the site level is the big black hole. Sponsors do very well at the study level and at the country level. It's at the site level where they usually don't know what status the documents are in, or they're usually missing a lot.
I'm glad you added it because it is the laggard. Electronic documentation at the site level is the laggard versus sponsor and CRO side TMF management. So completely agree. And Constantina added one more. Users save a lot of time during reconciliation via the reports, etc. Completely agree. Janine, when you were mentioning the types of reports, I think the most popular one on our side, you can picture it as a graph of document by state, placeholder state versus final state versus QC state. And you can picture that graph, and what you want to see is lots of things moving along, not a lot of things stuck in earlier stages for excessive duration. So that's a really powerful way to look. Now, I wanted to move towards wrap up, about 5 more minutes, I think. I wanted to pose this now to Janine, let her talk for a while. I'll probably interrupt and ask a few questions. But I wanted to pose this scenario. You have a client, they're listening right now, and they call you afterwards and say, oh my God, we're ready. We just have to get this thing done. We have to move towards inspection readiness. Now, my question isn't about eTMF specifically. If the question were, how do I adopt an eTMF, I would answer it. I'm interested in moving towards inspection readiness. So your client's current state is a small sponsor. They do their own trials. They have 2 or 3 trials going on, and they've always used Dropbox as a place to collect their stuff, and they really want to move to a more inspection-ready model. What would you advise them or counsel them to do, and kind of in what order? I'm trying to fulfill the promise of our session today. What are the 5 steps to making the transition?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing you need to do is plan ahead. So step 1 is don't wait for the letter from the FDA saying you will be audited. If you wait for that letter, you may already be in a really tense situation. They usually give you 90 days notice, but not always, and they don't have to. So plan ahead. That's number 1. Number 2 is dedicate resources. If you are in a scenario, you gave me a smaller sponsor and you do everything in-house, or you do most things in-house, which I think is very typical. Honestly, I bet you more than half of the sponsors on the phone today, or on the webinar today, I should say, are sponsors who do a lot in-house. And a la carte management of clinical trials is very popular right now. There probably are in play, though, consultant or contract CRAs at the very least. And they're important in this scenario, which is why I want to mention them now. So if you're doing this yourself, you need to dedicate a resource to supporting this. It doesn't have to be a TMF manager. It more than likely is a CTM or a clinical trial assistant, somebody who is familiar with the documents and familiar with how they're getting into Dropbox and knows what's required for ICH GCP compliance. But they're probably the ones putting the stuff in Dropbox now. Earmark them and have them set aside a portion of their time to dedicate to this, because if it is not part of their professional goal, and it is not part of your company's business goal to support this, it's not going to happen in a timely fashion, and it's going to be very stressful at the end, because it's going to pile up, and then you're going to need to deal with it just in time right before the auditor comes, and you don't want to do that. So plan ahead.
Quick interruption, which is for the audience to know, if you can look at your public chat box on the right. Again, if you're in full screen mode, hit escape. I'm documenting these points that Janine is making. So you can copy and paste if you're looking for a takeaway. Go ahead, Janine.
Yeah, dedicate a resource. It doesn't have to be a TMF expert, moral of that story. Make it somebody who's familiar with the documents that you've got. Third thing is create a process. If you already have a process for managing your documents in Dropbox, fantastic. Take that process and morph it into something that is going to help you migrate and maintain documents in a compliant system. So you need a process in place, and I would start that process development way before you decide your next step, which is you got to select a system. So select a system that's right-sized for you, and if you need assistance selecting a system, a lot of the companies that sell systems, I know that Agatha, you're one of them, offers support for you when you call them. You can call up most of these companies, and they will help you figure out if they are right-sized for you, and if so, what modules or what offerings they have that are the best suited for your situation right now. And you have to ask them up front, how long is the implementation? Because if you have an upcoming audit, you need to know if you're calling a supplier, a provider, or a service company that is going to take 6 months to start you. And there are companies that take that long. There are companies that take longer than that. And there are companies that can take 6 weeks, and there are companies that I've seen be able to pull off in 6 days. So if you have an upcoming audit, or if you're not even an audit, let's just say you're having an internal quality review. Let's say your stakeholders or your CEO is going to look at you and say, how is our clinical development department doing? Do we need to change anything, or are you guys good on your own? You want to be ready for that to be looked at anytime by anybody who's inspecting you, not just the government agency. And you may have very much a very limited time to respond to an internal review, right? So make sure that you choose a company that can get you up and running in the time frame that you actually have available to you. You can always add modules later on, so pick the system that you need that's right size. Don't pick what you think you're going to need down the road because you're going to become a big company and you're going to have lots of registration studies. Worry about that then. For today, pick what's right sized for you. It is easier than you think to expand these systems or to migrate to a new system when you become a larger company. So once you selected your system, go ahead, Ken.
Literally all I said was cool because I'm trying to be a hipster, but the other thing I will add is that while you're doing that, selecting a system, asking those questions, I always throw in, do a trial, get access to the system. Any good vendor will want to work with you through a trial because, you know, claims are one thing, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So bring it in, have a small team, put some documents and go through the workflows and experience. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I completely support that. And any vendor who's reluctant to do that for you maybe isn't the right vendor for you at this time. The next thing you need to do is you have a vendor on board, you have basic process in place for how you're going to manage your documents in that new system, or maybe you don't. Maybe you weren't really sure what the process should look like. Maybe you're not really sure how often quality checks are supposed to happen, or you are a company that says, look, we have been there and done this. We don't have the resources for this. Our CTMs and CTAs are maxed. We're looking for consultants as we speak. We simply don't have the time. And that is probably, 80% of when we speak with smaller pharma companies or sometimes with bigger site operations. You simply don't have the time, and we get it. At that point, start talking to vendors who you know offer services. And here's the scoop. Most vendors who provide TMF software as a service or eClinical suites as a service, software as a service, they provide services too. So don't feel like you can't move into a TMF because you don't have the bandwidth in your company to do it. You can get services through these companies, and it can be a very temporary thing. So there's a lot of benefit to doing it yourself in-house, and I always advocate for that first. But I also have seen companies not adopt an eTMF system because they feel like they don't have a TMF manager and they simply can't do it, and their people currently in clinical operations don't have the bandwidth to do it. And if those are the cases, companies like Agatha and most other TMF companies offer services as well. So inquire about the services when you call. It doesn't mean that it has to be a lot of services or that it has to be expensive. It's cheaper than you think, and it might be the catalyst that gets you off the ground and gets you into a TMF system, a basic system. And then once you have experience with a basic system, look to build out into fancier things. But my recommendation is start simple, start with what's palatable, and start with what you can afford from a budgetary perspective, and do not be paralyzed by the idea that you don't have anybody in-house to do it. Seek services with systems and seek them as a package deal. And I think that's going to make your lives a lot easier.
I lost track. Did that get us to the end of your list?
I think that was 5. There's probably 50 more, but I gave you the 5 to start. I feel like the audience is probably here for two reasons, because they're really interested in TMF and they want to know what technology is out there. And I think they're also here because a lot of them just want some practical guidelines for how to do stuff, right? How to get from point A to point B. And if point A is we've got a bunch of stuff in a Dropbox right now and we're looking at an inspection, getting to point B is getting to a point where you can be inspected, and getting your documents into a TMF, whether it's utilizing your own manpower or utilizing a combination of your own oversight and a services company that can get those documents in there quickly for you, is the way to inspection readiness, then that's a good start. That's a really good start.
We have a few questions that have come in. Pleased with that. Before we do, I like to create a dividing line between what we're saying and the questions in case some people have to leave. So I wanted to be sure I did these takeaways. Took me a long time to find the takeaway boxes to make this graphic, so I felt I needed to use it. So here are just restatements for you. The inspection readiness is not just a better way to operate. It really does improve quality, it saves money, and it's required. So all of these things are true. Maintaining inspection readiness actually saves time and money. When you look at getting ready retroactively or reactively, you're going to find it's going to be less costly to be prepared properly all the time, and it certainly reduces risk. An eTMF is, for all practical purposes, essential for maintaining inspection readiness. Practical purpose is a key qualifier there. It's not that it can't be done. It's just, why would you? It's a lot easier with an eTMF and probably at the same cost. The functional requirements for an eTMF are well understood. As I said, it's silly to write up requirements and say it needs to be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, because of course it has to be that. Of course it has to have audit. It has a bunch of courses. The basic functional footprint is pretty clear. So choose based on the things that Janine was just talking about. Ease of use. For me, always ease of deployment and speed of deployment and cost. That's where this market is. It's not about features right now. It's much more about those softer features. And one last thing, transitioning to inspection readiness is mostly a matter of making the decision to do so. Having C-level support, having a plan, as Janine went through, and her 5 steps, all are not rocket science. The key thing here is to make the decision, make the determination, and get the C-level support, the executive support, to get it done. Though I will emphasize what you said, Janine, because we just had a customer who went through this. If you don't make it someone's job and you don't give them time to do it, you say, everyone's responsible for this and you'll have to fit it in your spare time, that won't work. Someone needs to own the initiative, and someone needs to be incented and have the time to do the initiative. We had a situation where a customer had the right person, got off to a great start, happened to leave the company, and the whole thing foundered when it didn't have that leadership. So it's a negative example of your point. So there are a few questions, Gina. I wrote you a note. I hope you saw that. And if you'd repeat a couple of those, we'll wrap up, okay?
Sure, we'll get to as many as we can in the remaining time. First question, is the reference model the same as the TMF plan?
So it's not. Yeah, I will, because it's probably the simplest one and I can actually answer it. It's not. So the reference model, I forget the organization that does it. ACH does reference model? I forget.
DIA, the DIA.
Yeah. DIA reference model. Thank you, Janine. So the DIA reference model, if you look it up, has been in existence for several years. And what it is a superset of what common sense says should be in a TMF. It's not a regulatory requirement that all studies must be in the DIA reference model. It's simply essentially a template that says, here's a great way to organize a TMF set of documents. And it breaks them down by type or artifact type, by country, etc. So it's a very useful structure or model. And then it names the artifacts that are expected. As we've said, though, it is a reference model. It is not the template for every study. It's a superset that should be used as an organizing principle and as a starting point. And then for your study, based on the type of study, whether it's a device or a drug, will differ from the reference model. It might not include all those documents, and it might include other documents. Maybe you're measuring tumor size, and that's a key thing that you have in your study that's not in the reference model. So that's how I would explain it. The plan is just the plan. The plan, think of it as a project plan. And maybe you could speak to that for a second better than I could, Janine. So Samantha's question was, is the plan different than the reference model? I talked to the reference model. How about you talk to the plan?
Sure. Yeah, the plan is very different than the reference model. The reference model, as you customize it to your study, goes into the plan, and that's part of it. But the plan includes the index that we talked about earlier, the ever important TMF index of expected documents. The plan includes how you're going to manage the TMF, and it becomes really business critical when you have CROs or CRA consultants involved. So the plan is the structure of how you're going to approach the maintenance and management and quality health checking of your TMF. It really is required, and it's something that you need to have in place before you start your study, if at all possible. But if you haven't created it yet, or if you switch mid-study from something like a box to a formal TMF system, you can create it at any point in time, but I always recommend doing it prior to the study. If you work with a TMF services group, they can create this for you. All of the groups should have pretty solid templates.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we have one more question. Are investigator-initiated studies subjected to FDA audits?
So I glanced at that, and my answer was simplistic. Again, I'm not as knowledgeable about you as this, other than the software in this space. I would have thought, yeah, of course, any study is subject to an FDA audit. So he's saying investigator initiated. I don't understand that differentiation, Janine, do you?
I do. Investigator-initiated studies or investigator-initiated grant studies are usually single site, single investigator studies, and it's a request by an investigator to a pharmaceutical company to run a particular trial using a particular commercial product or an investigational, so a pipeline or a commercial product, something that might already be on the market or something that might not be on the market yet. I wouldn't say they are subject to FDA audits in the same way that a clinical trial is, because you're not looking through an investigator-initiated study. You're looking, the goal is knowledge creation and not necessarily to market a drug. And the FDA is really concerned with marketing drugs. However, I will never say that the FDA would not audit an investigator-initiated study, because it could be that the information that's being collected in that study is relevant or feeds up into a larger question that the FDA could concern itself with at any point in time. So here's what I would recommend to you. Run that study as if you could be audited by the FDA, or you could be audited by your sponsor, because the sponsor who's paying for that study may want to know that the study is being done according to, at the bare minimum, good clinical practice, and particularly human subject protection. And they may want to come in and look at you for that particular purpose alone, because it relates to their drug. So whether you're being sponsor audited or FDA audited, it doesn't matter. You still want to keep your documents in a way that allows you to be audited, because you never know what the FDA is seeing in a bigger picture level that might relate to what you're doing in addition to other things.
Thank you for that. I knew you'd be the one to answer that question. Awesome. And on my behalf, that's a funny way to say it, on Janine's and my behalf, I'm going to say thank you to everyone. We ran a couple of minutes over. Our producer does have a quick wrap-up statement, but I just want to say thank you all for joining, and as they say sometimes, for playing our game. It was fun seeing you guys in the chat boxes and stuff. We'll see you next time. There'll be another. There always is. Go ahead, Gina.
Well, thank you all very much. On behalf of WCG CenterWatch and Agatha, thank you to our participants for joining us today. Please be sure to fill out the survey at the conclusion of the webinar. Your feedback is very important to us. This now concludes the webinar. Have a great day, and I hope you join us again in the future.